In the shadow of an abandoned cornfield, secrets lie buried, and some refuse to stay hidden. One fateful night, a cruel prank leaves Mabel King, a resilient elderly woman, buried alive by a group of reckless teenagers. As Mabel fights for survival, the sleepy southern town of Willowbrook is forced to confront its darkest corners. Eli Harris, a shy and guilt-ridden boy, is torn between loyalty to the group's ruthless leader, Travis McNeil, and the values instilled by his late grandmother. Meanwhile, Clara Wilson, a determined journalist, returns to her hometown and stumbles upon the truth. A chilling connection between the attack on Mabel and a long-buried crime tied to Willowbrook's most powerful family. As the lines between justice, forgiveness, and redemption blur, Mabel makes an extraordinary choice. Instead of vengeance, she offers the boys a chance to rebuild what they destroyed. But as the secrets of the cornfield begin to unravel, the townspeople must ask themselves, can they heal from the sins of their past, or are some wounds too deep to mend? Heart-stopping, emotionally gripping, and filled with unexpected twists, beneath the whispering corn is a story of courage, redemption, and the resilience of the human spirit. Mabel King tugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the narrow dirt road, the only path that led back to her modest home. The cool night air carried the faint scent of drying corn and earth, a reminder of the fields that flanked the road. The paper bag in her hand rustled softly, filled with leftovers from the church supper she planned to leave for Mr. Carter, her ailing neighbor. Her silver hair glistened under the moonlight, and her green eyes darted to the rustling corn stalks. She whispered a prayer under her breath, a habit she kept whenever she walked home after dark. The faint rumble of a truck engine broke her concentration. Headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the shadows. Mabel moved closer to the edge of the road, hoping the vehicle would pass without incident. As the truck slowed, her heart quickened. She recognized it, a battered pickup often seen at the gas station, its bed usually crowded with rowdy boys. Tonight was no different. The truck stopped beside her, and 5 boys perched on its edges hooted and hollered. Travis McNeil, the leader, hopped down, his broad shoulders and cocky smirk unmistakable. His dark eyes gleamed with mischief as he swaggered toward her. "Well, if it isn't Miss King," he drawled. "Out for a little midnight stroll, are we?" Mabel kept walking, her voice steady but firm. "Good evening, Travis. It's late. Shouldn't you boys be heading home?" Travis's grin widened as his friends laughed behind him. "What's the rush? We're just having some fun." He blocked her path, leaning closer. "Unless you're too good to talk to us." Mabel met his gaze without flinching. "I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Travis feigned shock, turning to his friends. "Hear that? Miss King thinks we're trouble." The others laughed again, except for one. Eli Harris. His sandy blonde hair fell into his nervous blue eyes as he avoided looking at Mabel. He shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. "Let her go, Travis," Eli finally mumbled. His voice was barely audible over the others' laughter, but it silenced them all. Travis turned sharply, his grin disappearing. "You getting soft, Eli?" Eli shrank under his glare, stammering, It's late. We should go." Travis's smirk returned, but it was colder now. "Nah, I think we'll stay." Before Mabel could react, 2 of the boys grabbed her arms, dragging her into the field. She dropped her bag, its contents spilling onto the dirt road. She struggled, but their grip was strong. "No," she shouted, her voice carrying into the still night. "Let me go." Travis chuckled darkly, leading the group deeper into the cornfield. His flashlight illuminated a shallow pit. "Put her in." The boys hesitated. Chris, tall and gangly, glanced nervously at Eli. "Come on, Travis. This is too much." "Do it," Travis snapped. "Unless you want to take her place." Reluctantly, they obeyed, shoving Mabel into the pit. She fell hard, her hands scraping against the dirt. The cold soil bit into her skin as they began shoveling dirt over her. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Travis taunted. "Maybe this will teach you some respect." Eli's hands trembled as he held his shovel. He dropped it, stepping back. "I can't. This is wrong." Travis turned on him, his voice low and menacing. "Then leave. But remember, if you talk, we're all going down." Eli stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then, he turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Roscoe Thompson's tractor rumbled softly as he navigated the quiet road home. His eyes scanned the fields, his flashlight sweeping over the rustling stalks. A faint cry stopped him cold. He cut the engine, listening. The voice came again, faint but desperate. "Help, please." Roscoe grabbed his flashlight and ran toward the sound. When the beam landed on the disturbed pit, his heart sank. Mabel's face, streaked with tears and dirt, looked up at him. "Good Lord," he muttered, dropping to his knees. "Miss King, what happened?" "Boys," she croaked. "They buried me." Roscoe worked quickly, scooping the dirt away with his hands until Mabel could move. He helped her to her feet, her body trembling. "Let's get you out of here," he said, his voice steady. Mabel nodded weakly. "Thank you." Eli sat on the edge of his bed, his hands buried in his hair. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. "Do what's right, even when it's hard." But tonight, he'd done nothing. He'd watched as Mabel was dragged away, his fear overpowering his conscience. The image of her tear-streaked face haunted him. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his fault, that he wasn't the one in charge, but the excuses felt hollow. He glanced at his phone. His thumb hovered over Travis's name, but he couldn't bring himself to call. Instead, he opened a blank text and typed, "We need to talk." His finger hesitated over the send button. With a shaky breath, he pressed it. The screen glowed in the darkness, the words staring back at him. Eli lay back on his bed, his stomach twisting. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of standing up to Travis made his chest tighten. As the first light of dawn crept through his window, Eli resolved to speak to Travis. He couldn't erase what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, he could start making it right. Eli hesitated outside the McNeil estate, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. The massive white pillars of the house loomed above him, intimidating even in daylight. Taking a deep breath, he rang the doorbell. Travis answered, his smirk fading when he saw Eli. "What are you doing here?" Eli's voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "We need to talk. About last night." Travis leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "There's nothing to talk about. It's over." "It's not over," Eli snapped. "She could have died. Travis, do you even care?" Travis's dark eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Watch your mouth, Eli. You don't want to start something you can't finish." Eli took a step back but held his ground. "We should turn ourselves in." Travis sparked a laugh. "You're kidding, right? If you do something stupid, we all go down. And trust me, I'll make sure you're the one who pays the most." As Eli turned to leave, Travis called after him, his voice dripping with disdain. "Don't forget, Eli. Nobody likes a snitch." At Roscoe's kitchen table, Mabel cradled a steaming cup of tea. Her hands still ached from the night before, but her mind was sharp. Roscoe paced the small kitchen, his boots creaking on the floorboards. "You need to go to the sheriff," he said firmly. "Those boys deserve to be punished." Mabel shook her head. "And what good will that do, Roscoe? They'll deny it. Travis's family has enough money and power to bury the truth faster than they buried me." Roscoe leaned against the counter, his expression grim. "So what's your plan?" "I'm going to face them," Mabel replied. "They need to understand what they've done. Not just to me, but to themselves." Roscoe sighed. "You're stronger than most, Mabel. But are you sure they deserve a second chance?" Her eyes softened. "Everyone deserves a chance to change, Roscoe. Even them." Clara Wilson pulled into her father's driveway, her car kicking up dust on the gravel. The house, with its sagging porch and peeling paint, was a stark contrast to her bustling life in the city. As she stepped out, her father greeted her with a weak smile from the front door. "Welcome home, kiddo," he said, his voice raspier than she remembered. Clara hugged him tightly. "Good to be back, Dad." Later that evening, as they sat on the porch, Clara listened as her father recounted the latest gossip from town. "Something happened to Mabel King," he said. "Folks are saying it's bad." Clara's journalist instincts kicked in. "What happened?" "Not sure," he replied. "But whatever it is, people are talking about Travis McNeil and his gang." Clara's mind raced. She'd always hated Travis's smugness growing up. If he was involved, she wanted to find out. The old gas station was quiet as the boys gathered near the side of the building. Chris leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, while Danny fiddled nervously with his jacket zipper. Eli arrived last, his face pale. "We need to talk." Chris scoffed. "You think Travis will let us?" Danny looked between them, his voice shaky. "Maybe we should just forget about it. Pretend it didn't happen." Eli shook his head. "I can't. Can you?" Chris hesitated, then sighed. "No." "But Travis." "Travis isn't our boss," Eli interrupted. "We can do what's right without him." Before anyone could respond, Travis's truck roared into the lot. He jumped out, his expression dark. "What's this? A little mutiny?" Eli met his glare. "We're just talking." "Don't," Travis snapped. "There's nothing to talk about." "Got it." The group fell silent as Travis stared them down, his control unshaken, for now. Eli sat on his porch, his head in his hands, when a shadow fell over him. Looking up, he saw Mabel standing at the gate. Her green eyes were steady, her expression calm. "Miss King," he stammered, standing quickly. I'm so sorry." "I know, Eli," Mabel said softly. "That's why I'm here." She stepped closer, her voice firm but kind. "You're better than what you did last night. I see it in you. But you have to prove it." "How?" Eli asked, his voice breaking. "Gather the others," Mabel replied. "Meet me at the church tomorrow. It's time to face the truth." Eli nodded, tears in his eyes. "I'll try." "You'll do more than try," Mabel said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "You'll do what's right." As she walked away, Eli felt a flicker of hope. It was time to make things right. Eli paced nervously outside the church, the weight of the past few days pressing on him. One by one, the boys arrived. Chris gave him a nod, but Danny kept his head down. Travis was last, his jaw tight and his eyes burning with defiance. Mabel waited inside, seated at the front pew. As they shuffled in, her calm gaze swept over them. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice steady. "I know this wasn't easy." Travis scoffed. What's the point of this? You gonna lecture us? Mabel stood, her silver hair glinting in the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. I'm giving you a chance to make this right, she said. You hurt me, but more than that, you've hurt yourselves. That kind of hate eats away at the soul. Chris shifted uncomfortably. What do you want us to do? Help me rebuild, Mabel replied. Not just the church, but the trust you've broken. Travis laughed bitterly. You think fixing some benches will change anything? No, Mabel said firmly, but it's a start. Clara sat across from Roscoe in his kitchen, her notebook open. Tell me about the night you found Mabel. Roscoe leaned back, his weathered hands gripping his coffee mug. I was coming home late, heard her calling out. She was buried up to her neck in that cursed field. Cursed? Clara raised an eyebrow. Roscoe nodded grimly. Years ago, that field saw things no one talks about. Folks were lynched there. Families ruined. I wouldn't be surprised if what happened to Mabel was tied to all that. Clara's pen froze mid-sentence. Do you think it was just these boys? Or is there something bigger going on? Roscoe hesitated. Travis's daddy owns half this town. If there's more to it, he'd know. Clara's mind raced. If this was true, her story could shake the foundations of Willowbrook. Thank you, Roscoe. I'll dig deeper. You do that, he said. But be careful. The McNeils don't take kindly to anyone poking around their business. Back at the gas station, Travis slammed his fist on the hood of his truck. I don't trust her, he spat. She's trying to make us feel guilty. Eli crossed his arms, his voice steady. Because we should feel guilty, Travis. We buried her alive. Chris stepped forward, his voice quieter. Maybe Eli's right. Helping her. Maybe it's not such a bad idea. Travis's glare shot to Chris. You're siding with him now? Danny, standing at the edge of the group, spoke up timidly. We don't have to do this, Travis. We can walk away. No, we can't, Travis growled. You think she's gonna forgive us? She's just waiting to turn us in. Eli stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. She already forgave us, Travis. The question is whether you can forgive yourself. For a moment, Travis's bravado faltered. He looked away, his fists clenching at his sides. You're all fools. At the diner downtown, whispers of the church meeting spread like wildfire. Some supported Mabel's decision to give the boys a chance to redeem themselves. Others, especially those tied to the McNeils, dismissed it as a pointless gesture. She's too soft, one man muttered. They deserve to rot in jail. Maybe, another said. But when's the last time this town showed anyone mercy? At a corner booth, Clara listened quietly, jotting down notes. The divisions in the community ran deeper than she'd realized. Mabel's attack wasn't just about a prank gone wrong. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. When Clara approached the counter to pay, the waitress leaned in. You watch yourself, honey. Asking too many questions in this town ain't safe. Clara smiled politely, but her resolve only strengthened. She had a story to uncover, and no one was going to stop her. The next day, the boys met at the churchyard. Travis lingered by his truck, watching as Eli, Chris, and Danny began clearing debris from the storm-damaged building. Come on, Travis, Eli called out. We could use the help. Travis sneered. I don't take orders from you. It's not about orders, Eli said, walking up to him. It's about doing what's right. For once. Chris joined him, holding a hammer. He's right, man. We messed up. This is our chance to fix it. Travis looked between them, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he might leave. Then, with a deep sigh, He grabbed a toolbox from his truck and joined them. As the boys worked, Mabel watched from the church steps, a faint smile on her face. It was only a small step, but it was a step forward. Clara sat in the county records office, surrounded by dusty files and fading photographs. Her search for answers about the cornfield had taken her to old newspaper archives. As she sifted through the pages, a headline caught her eye: "Tragedy strikes Willowbrook. Lynchings in the cornfield." Her breath caught as she read about a racially motivated crime that had occurred decades ago. The victim was an ancestor of Mabel's, a man who had been accused of a crime without evidence and brutally murdered. The article noted that the McNeil family had been involved in the accusations, though the records were vague. Clara's jaw tightened. This isn't just a prank gone wrong. It's history repeating itself. She packed up her notes and made her way to Roscoe's farm. "You were right," she told him as she stepped into his kitchen. The McNeils were involved in that lynching, and the same field was used. "This isn't a coincidence." Roscoe shook his head grimly. "That family's done more harm than good in this town. Question is, what are you gonna do about it?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "Expose the truth." Eli and Chris sat on Mabel's porch, their heads bowed. The evening sun cast long shadows, and the quiet hum of cicadas filled the air. "I've been thinking," Eli began hesitantly, "about my grandmother. She always said the right thing to do was the hardest thing." Mabel smiled gently. "Your grandmother was a wise woman." Chris fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. "I don't know if I can make up for what we did." "You can't undo the past," Mabel said, her voice steady. "But you can choose a different path moving forward. That's all I ask." Eli looked up, his eyes filled with determination. "I want to help, however I can." "Good," Mabel said, "because healing isn't just about the one who's hurt. It's about everyone involved." Travis sat alone in his truck, parked on the outskirts of town. He stared out at the cornfield, the memories of that night playing over and over in his mind. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The others had started helping Mabel, leaving him behind. Even his closest friends were slipping away. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, but he refused to admit it. "I didn't do anything wrong. They're the ones betraying me." His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Dinner tonight. Don't be late." Travis groaned, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. His father had always demanded perfection, and Travis knew any sign of weakness would be met with ridicule. He turned the key in the ignition and drove off, the sound of gravel crunching beneath his tires. The church was packed that evening, the pews filled with both supporters and skeptics. Mabel stood at the front, her hands clasped. Clara was beside her, clutching a folder of documents. "I invited you all here tonight," Mabel began, her voice carrying through the room, "because this town has a problem. Not just with what happened to me, but with the hatred and silence that's festered here for generations." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One man stood up. "We're not all like that, Mabel. You know that. And I know some of you have stood by while it happened," she replied calmly. "This isn't just about me. It's about what we want Willowbrook to be." Clara stepped forward. "I've uncovered records that tie the McNeil family to a lynching in the same cornfield where Mabel was attacked. This isn't just history. It's a pattern." The room erupted into shouts and arguments. Some defended the McNeils, while others demanded accountability. In the chaos, Travis slipped out the back, his face pale. The next morning, the tension in Willowbrook was palpable. At the diner, groups huddled in heated discussions. On the streets, neighbors avoided eye contact. Eli and Chris continued their work at the church, hammering planks into place. "Do you think things will ever change?" Chris asked. Eli paused, wiping sweat from his brow. They have to. It's up to us to make sure they do. Meanwhile, Clara sat in her father's living room, typing furiously on her laptop. She was determined to publish her findings, knowing it could either bring the town together or tear it apart. Across town, Mabel sat on her porch, watching the world go by. Despite the turmoil, she felt a sense of hope. Change was painful, but it was necessary. As the sun set over Willowbrook, the stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. Travis would have to face the truth, and the town would have to decide whether to embrace change or cling to the past. The sound of tools scraping would fill the air as Eli, Chris, and Danny worked on repairing the church steps. Travis lingered at the edge of the yard, his hands jammed into his pockets. He watched them with a growing knot of anger and anxiety. Eli looked up and waved. "Travis, grab a hammer. We could use an extra set of hands." Travis's face twisted in a scowl. "You think fixing some stairs makes up for what happened?" Eli stood, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's a start." "Start of what? Letting her act like she's better than us?" Travis snapped, his voice rising. "She's using you to make herself look good." Chris stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "No, Travis. She's showing us how to be better than we were." "Better?" Travis sneered. "You think bowing to her makes you better?" "You know it's not about that," Eli said quietly. "It's about fixing what we broke." Travis's hands clenched into fists. "You're all fools. You're letting her play you." Eli met his gaze. "Maybe we're tired of playing by your rules." Travis stormed off, his chest heaving with frustration. He didn't know how to stop the growing distance between him and the others, and it terrified him. The public meeting at the community center buzzed with tension. Residents filled the room, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. At the front, Mabel sat beside Clara, her calm presence a stark contrast to the murmur of voices. Eli stood nervously at the podium, gripping the edges as he scanned the crowd. His eyes met Mabel's, and she nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, Eli began. "I need to tell you all something about what happened to Ms. King that night." A hush fell over the room as he continued. "I was part of it. I didn't stop it. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Gasps rippled through the audience. Eli pressed on, his voice shaking but determined. "It wasn't just a prank. It was wrong. And we need to face what we did." Clara stood, holding a folder. "This isn't just about one night. The cornfield has been a site of violence for decades. The McNeil family's involvement in a lynching years ago is part of that history." The room erupted into a mix of shouts and whispers. At the back, Travis's father stood, his face flushed with anger. "You have no proof," he barked. "I have records," Clara said calmly. "And witnesses." Eli stepped back, his heart pounding, but a small sense of relief washed over him. He had done what was right. The next morning, Willowbrook woke to the sound of papers hitting porches. Clara's article was front-page news, the bold headline reading, "Beneath the Whispering Corn, Willowbrook's Dark Legacy." Travis sat at his kitchen table, staring at the article. His father stormed in, slamming the paper onto the table. "This is your fault," he growled. "You've brought shame to this family." Travis looked up, his face pale. "I didn't tell her anything." "Doesn't matter," his father snapped. "Fix this. Now." Travis knew there was no fixing it. The truth was out, and he was drowning in the weight of it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mabel sat on her porch, sipping tea. The creak of footsteps on her wooden steps made her look up. Travis stood there, His shoulders slumped, his expression torn between anger and shame. "I need to talk to you," he muttered. Mabel nodded and gestured to the chair beside her. Travis hesitated before sitting down. "I don't get it," he said after a long silence. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Mabel studied him for a moment before answering. "What would that have changed? Locking you up wouldn't make you understand what you've done." Travis's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know?" "I think you're still trying to prove something," Mabel said softly. "To yourself, to your father. But you don't have to carry his weight, Travis." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He looked away, his eyes burning. "I don't know how to fix it." "You start by owning it," Mabel said, "and by choosing to be better." The church bell rang softly as the town gathered for a service unlike any other. The boys had finished the repairs, the once damaged building now standing as a symbol of renewal. Travis stood beside Eli and Chris, his head bowed. When Mabel approached, he looked up. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For everything." Mabel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you." As the service began, Clara watched from the back pew, her notebook tucked away. For the first time, she felt like Willowbrook might truly change. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the town. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The old wooden doors of the church creaked open as sunlight poured into the room. Mabel stood at the threshold, her green eyes sweeping over the space that had been transformed. The pews gleamed with fresh polish, the repaired windows allowed light to dance across the floor, and the once damaged altar stood tall and proud. Eli, Chris, Danny, and even Travis stood off to the side, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt but beaming with pride. Mabel turned to them, her smile warm and grateful. "You've done something wonderful here," she said softly. "This isn't just a building. It's a place where people can heal." Eli stepped forward, wiping his hands on his jeans. "We just wanted to fix what we could, Miss King." "You've done more than fix," Mabel replied. "You've shown that change is possible." The boys exchanged glances, a mixture of relief and newfound confidence spreading among them. For the first time, they felt like they were part of something meaningful. Later that afternoon, the churchyard buzzed with activity as the community gathered for the rededication. Mabel stood at the center, greeting neighbors who had come to celebrate the restoration. Travis lingered near the back, his hands shoved into his pockets. The weight of everything he'd done and the truth Clara had uncovered pressed heavily on him. He watched as Mabel laughed softly with an elderly man, her strength and grace undeniable. Finally, Travis took a deep breath and approached her. "Miss King," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Mabel turned, her expression unreadable. "Travis." He hesitated, looking down at his shoes. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." Mabel studied him for a moment before placing a hand on his shoulder. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." "Thank you for saying it." Travis nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I already have," Mabel said simply. "But forgiveness doesn't erase responsibility. What you do from here matters more." Her words lingered with Travis as he stepped back, feeling both lighter and more determined to change. The following morning, Clara packed the last of her things into her car. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen, where her father sat reading her published article. "You really did it," he said, his voice tinged with pride. "You've shaken this town awake." Clara smiled, leaning against the doorframe. "It was Mabel who did that. I just told her story." Her father looked up, his hazel eyes warm. "You're leaving already?" "There's more work to do," Clara replied. "But I'll be back." Willowbrook still has a lot of healing left. As she hugged her father goodbye and drove out of town, Clara felt a deep sense of purpose. The story wasn't just about exposing the past. It was about paving the way for a better future. Eli stood at the edge of the cornfield, the stalks rustling softly in the breeze. The place that had once been a symbol of guilt and fear now felt different. He took a deep breath, letting the warm air fill his lungs. Chris approached, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" Eli nodded. "Yeah, just thinking about how far we've come." Chris smiled. "You should be proud. You started this." Eli shook his head. "It wasn't just me. We all made this happen." As they walked back toward the church, Eli felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He vowed to carry Mabel's lessons with him and to keep standing up for what was right. Mabel sat on her porch that evening, watching the town settle into the quiet rhythm of dusk. The soft glow of the restored church steeple was visible in the distance, a beacon of hope for a community that had weathered so much. Roscoe joined her, handing her a glass of sweet tea. "You did good, Mabel." "We all did," she replied. "It's a start." Roscoe nodded. "Think they'll keep it up?" "They will," Mabel said confidently. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but the seeds are planted." As the stars began to dot the sky, Mabel smiled, knowing that while there was still work to be done, Willowbrook was on its way to healing.